Hello, great souls. So good to be with you today. Welcome to Living Yoga Satsang, Reflections on Autobiography of a Yogi. Let's begin together with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of Kriya Yoga, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, and Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, we humbly bow to you all. Guide us this day as we reflect upon these teachings. Help us to perceive the divine light and wisdom within them, and to apply this wisdom and this light to our lives. May we awaken to our own highest reality and share this divine light, divine joy, divine love with all. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, so we are on chapter, let me get to the front of the chapter here, so I give you the right one. Let me put this down. It's a long chapter. Okay, let's see. 24. I become a monk of the Swami order. So I started last week talking about what Yogananda said here in terms of his experience of becoming a Swami, and I'll just recap a tiny bit of what I said, that he had asked several times, he had asked Sri Yukteswar several times if he could be made a monk, and says in here that Sri Yukteswar waited until he felt that Yogananda had demonstrated a sincerity and a readiness for that vow. And so this chapter begins by him asking, and Sri Yukteswar saying, yes, I will make you a monk. He gave him the title of Swami in what Yogananda said, a fairly unceremonious way, because as Sri Yukteswar explained to him, he didn't believe he wasn't, it's not that he didn't believe in the ceremony, it wasn't his way to do a lot of ceremony. So he said to Yogananda, I'm going to keep this very simple. From there, there's a little more I want to say about it that I didn't touch upon last week, and then we'll just follow through on the chapter, and we'll get as far as we get today. So one of the other things that happened as Yogananda became a monk is Sri Yukteswar said, I'm going to give you the privilege of choosing your own name. So indicating there that perhaps normally the one giving the facilitating the vow would give the name. So to say, I'm giving you the privilege. And Yogananda said he paused for a moment, and after a moment he chose Yogananda. Yoga, divine union with God through Ananda, which means bliss. So yoga through bliss, union, divine union through bliss. It's really beautiful. And what it reminded me of as I was reflecting on this is, and I'll say also how this ties into other things he talks about, because from here he moves into the distinction between a Swami and a yogi. And he said that some Swamis practice yoga, but not all Swamis. And then I know I've read Autobiography before. It's so dense and full of so much wisdom and richness that it's one of those books we can read many, many, many times, and people often do. So I didn't remember that before. And one of the things he said is that a Swami could move through life with dry reasoning. That would be much more jnana yoga. what we call in yoga, in Raja Yoga, what we call jnana. But he doesn't identify it specifically in that way. He just said that a Swami could do that. That would be a way that a Swami, their focus is more on the monastic component of being a Swami, very reserved, very withdrawn, and renunciation. Right? So Swami is the ultimate path of renunciation, committing our whole self to God in a formal way. And he goes on to talk about that anyone can practice yoga. It doesn't require a monastic vow. So he talks a little bit about that. But before I move into that, I want to stay on choosing a name and talk a little bit about that. Within Ananda, it's a very common practice for people to choose spiritual names. Not everyone does. So as with many aspects of yoga practice, it's very individual for it to feel right for your journey. And I remember, it was something I was curious about. I never thought that I would necessarily take a spiritual name. I just didn't know. Right? And then I remember a friend saying to me, I was asking her about her name, and she explained why she took a spiritual name. And she said, the spiritual name has two parts to it. One is it's an affirmation of consciousness. So every time she hears her name, it reminds her of what is deeply true about her, a soul quality that is true. So it's always an affirmation of that soul quality that she hears throughout the day, anytime someone says her name. And then it's also an aspiration of reaching within ourselves, rising to that soul quality. It's there, but the practice of yoga awakens us to our deeper inner reality. And actually having a spiritual name can support that. So when she told me that, I began to relate to spiritual names personally differently. I began to consider the value of having a spiritual name. So for a long time, I would ponder, not all the time, but it would just kind of come in. Right? I have many friends with spiritual names and friends who don't have a spiritual name, or their English name, or Indian name, which the Indian names are spiritual, right? That's part of the Indian practice. So an English name, well, I would say even other languages too. Many cultures focus on the meaning of a name when they're giving it. And that's part of what a spiritual name is about, is what does it mean? So here at Ananda, we're looking at those two qualities that my friend shared with me of aspiration and affirmation. So my husband James, for example, his name, he was named after one of the disciples of Jesus. And he used to be called Jim. That's how his name is James on his birth certificate, but he was called Jim. It's not uncommon for someone who has that name. And around the time that I took my spiritual name, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, he felt ready as well. But what felt right for him was to go by James to honor the spiritual nature of the name he was given. The other aspect of that is that Saint James is known for, if you're familiar with the Camino Santiago, which is the Pilgrim's Path, it's a beautiful trail. I have friends who've taken that in Spain. This is one of those things that, I don't know if I could say it calls to me, but it inspires me. So I don't know if it'll ever be part of this incarnation that I walk that path, that trail. But I am inspired, very inspired by that practice, that people from all over the world go and walk the trail, and it's transformative. I've just heard many things about it. Well, St. James, at the very end of that trail, there is St. James Church. And the symbol of St. James is a seashell because it ends at the sea. So all along the pilgrim's path, you see this little symbol that tells you you're on the path. And anyways, for James, it's life as a pilgrimage. And that's what his name means. Every time he hears it, he's reminded that life itself is a pilgrimage, which is very linked to the first vow in the renunciate order, the new renunciate order. I mentioned last week I would give you the title of that book. So the title is a renunciate order for the new age. A renunciate order for the new age, written by Nayaswami Kriyananda. So Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda. And you can actually find that book and find out more about the Nayaswami order by going to nayaswami.org. And I'll spell Nayaswami for you. It's NAYASWAMI.org. Okay, I just wanted to follow through on that because I mentioned it. For those who were here last week, I mentioned it last week. And the first vow is called the Pilgrim's Vow. It's a beautiful vow that I keep hung up in our home so that we keep it up in our home. As I love to see that vow. Both James and I have also taken the Tyagi vow. Today I'm dressed in white, and that's the color of Tyagi. The Tyagi, those who take the Tyagi vow, and this can be true within the Nayaswami order of whatever vow you take, Swami said that you should decide for yourself what's appropriate in terms of wearing the color. So it's been my experience, those who take the Nayaswami vow, which is the color of blue, a royal blue, they do tend, everyone that I know, right, so I could know a Nayaswami that doesn't wear blue, but they tend to always wear that color. Different, sometimes it's jeans and a blue top, other times it's a kurta that's blue. The same is true with the Brahmacharya vow, which is the color of yellow. It's been my experience, most who have chosen Brahmacharya as a vow, Tyagi and Brahmacharya are similar vows. Tyagi is for couples, and you could be single and take the Tyagi vow. I know you can, but so now I'm trying to ponder, what is that exact distinction? I don't know. I just know that if you're a couple, you take Tyagi, and if you are single, you take Brahmacharya. And I can't tell you more than that, and I don't have the book in front of me. But if you're curious, I recommend. It's a beautiful book, and it's very inspiring. So this is a new order that Swami felt inspired to create, and he felt that it was for Swamis and all those serious about their spiritual life. It gives them a way to make a commitment to that life that suits them. So I'm going to keep those two things connected. We're talking about a name. There's a similarity with a name and taking a vow. The idea is that it's something that will help you stay on track with your aspirations. And there is something quite powerful about committing to a vow. So with the name, I mentioned James. I'll share a little bit about my name, and then also just what I've observed in some beautiful stories I've heard within Ananda. In this case with Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar says, I'm giving you the privilege of choosing your name. I've never heard it said that way before, but I know that within Ananda, when Swami Kriyananda was still living, sometimes he would give a name, and sometimes he'd have someone choose a name. And with no reason as to why, that from those who've told the story, I've heard the story, they weren't given a reason on that, but there was one man, and I'm trying to remember his spiritual name right now, and it's eluding me, so I'm just going to tell you the story without knowing his name. I loved the story, and it was comforting and sweet, and it just felt like it had that sacred mystery of the spiritual journey. He asked Swamiji, he said he'd like to have a spiritual name. Swami encouraged him to pick a name. He picked a name. No. Swamiji said, that's not a good name for you. Okay. So then some time passed. He asked Swamiji for a name. Why don't you choose a name? He chose a name. No, that's not a good name. This went on for a long time. As I recall in this moment, it was years. It was years. I really think it was a decade this went on. It wasn't constant. Maybe once a year he'd ask. Swamiji would encourage him to pick a name. He would pick one. Nope, that's not a good name for you. And there was this journey of surrender that he talked about in telling the story. I read this story, and he was saying how what he noticed for himself is that he didn't understand all the things that were going on, but he knew that there was something meaningful happening in this exchange with he and Swamiji. And ultimately, he surrendered and just said, maybe I'm just not meant to have a spiritual name. Maybe shortly after that, maybe within a week, Swami gave him a name. And it was a perfect name, and he loved the name, and it suited him, and it felt right. I was reading this story right when it was the time where I felt I was ready. I was ready to have a spiritual name. There was no name that resonated for me, or if it did, someone else I knew had it, and I really didn't want to pick a name that a friend already had. That just didn't feel right to me. But so at a certain point, I reached out to Jyotish and Devi, who are the spiritual directors of Ananda worldwide, and asked them if they could help me with a spiritual name. I did have one name, interestingly, that I had thought about, and they were not sure. And so they said, let us sit with this. And it was, they wrote back and said, we don't feel that's the right name. So that's interesting, right? I will tell you a little bit more about it. It was actually one of the yamas, so talking about the niyamas, and Ashteya, which is the meaning of, I'm going to tell you that the literal meaning is non-stealing. The spiritual meaning of that is a confidence in the abundance of life. So I loved the sound of Ashteya, and I loved the meaning of the confidence in the abundance of life. But what Jyotish and Devi said to me, and they asked their Indian friends, that's what they said, we would like to ask some of our Indian friends, that too many people would only know it as non-stealing, and that's not an aspiration, right? It's not a high, elevated aspiration. It did not fit me. And so it just made me chuckle. I thought that makes sense. So they said for that reason, but they said, and so I guess I had written them and asking and saying about the name. So they said, choose another one. And that was the best I'd come up with. And I had been pondering for a while. I said, okay, so I went back, I looked at names, nothing stood out to me at all. And I then read the story of someone in Ananda who had gone through this, and I felt within myself, I'm just going to surrender. Right? I said this name, I'd asked them if they could choose one. I think I asked them, I'm not sure now, I can't remember, I think so though. And they said, why don't you pick one? And so I let it go. And same thing, within a week, they wrote to me, and they actually wrote to Shanti to me and said they had heard my name, Vivekadevi, and they were in Italy, and I don't remember if Devi had seen it or heard it, but they immediately thought of me and thought that fits. So Viveka means wisdom, discrimination. It's the perception of truth. That is a Jnana Yoga practice. And Devi is Divine Mother. So the meaning of Vivekadevi is Mother of Wisdom. It's such a beautiful name. I can't imagine I would ever have thought of it. I've never seen it anywhere else. And it felt right. So part of the journey for me also with the name, and I've listened to others go through this as well, where you're surrendering, you're asking for help from your teachers. Right, to say, what's your sense of not only what do you see in me, so to affirm what is present, but what also is a good aspiration for me. And wisdom, very good, very balancing for me. I'm a natural bhakti. I naturally relate to life from my heart. And wisdom has been part. In Raja Yoga, we look at there's 3 paths within Raja Yoga, which is considered the royal path of yoga. And as the chapter progresses, Yogananda begins to talk about Patanjali and the Eightfold Path. So sometimes it can be confusing. You'll hear different, Eightfold Path, and then there's 3 paths. The best way I've heard the 3 paths talked about is because they're within the Eightfold Path. They're not different than it. But it's a way of relating to yoga. It's a way of practicing yoga and understanding yoga. So I remember early when I was in training with yoga and trying to understand how to articulate and comprehend these 3 paths and how they fit together, what came to my mind was like a lens, a filter, what you're looking through. And so jnana, wisdom, discrimination, discernment, is to perceive the truth, and we often, it's not intellectual, but it is in the mind, where you are focusing with concentration on the facts of a situation, and you're listening more deeply within what you're seeing for the truth within it. So another way to describe jnana is that the mind, the conscious mind, would analyze a situation, figure it out, puzzle it out, like put the puzzle pieces together and solve it. That's a conscious mind approach, and that's not jnana. Jnana looks at the information, looks at the facts, and then goes deep within and lifts the awareness to soul consciousness or super consciousness and perceives the truth within it. And it's very clear when we perceive truth. We know within our being that it's right. No one has to tell us that it's true. It resonates for us. And so it's a practice, a very deep practice in yoga, cultivating intuition, cultivating the ability to perceive, to realize. This is yoga, the path of self-realization. This is not limited or contained within Ananda. Self-realization is a practice of yoga, and many traditions use that same term of self-realization. So this ability to realize our divine self, and that comes through jnana, perceiving the truth. It comes through karma yoga. These are the three paths. Karma is activity. So that's selfless service, to give of the self and to be doing it as a practice of serving the divine. So we say sometimes God serving God. You tune into within yourself that it's the divine energy flowing through you that is serving, and you are serving the divine in others. It keeps it from being, what we say sometimes in practice is too personal, too much me, too much about the self. It's and really what we're listening for is divine contact. So when we're able to really feel a sense of selflessness, freedom in our service, we do feel the qualities of God. It might be joy, it might be peace or calmness. And it's what I find beautiful about this is that it's not dependent on me liking what I'm doing, which is very surprising to the conscious mind. It would seem that the way to experience joy in activity I would need to like it. There's a very sweet story that Devi, I was mentioning Jyotish and Devi told about karma yoga. She was up at the meditation retreat and she was cutting up lemons for some activity. And someone came over, a guest was there, wanted to help out and said, and she was focusing on God, focusing on the divine, serving God by doing this activity and just kind of holding that this was for others. And she was filled with joy. So this man came by and was drawn to the magnetism of what she was doing and said, could I help you? And she said, sure. So she gave him a bowl. She had a bowl, he had a bowl, and she's cutting up. And a short time into it, he said something to the effect of, you have better lemons. So he was feeling that she was joyful because she had a better bowl of lemons. His lemons, they weren't as good as hers. And I don't know if he asked to switch bowls or he just got up and left. She didn't say anything, she just smiled. But she was telling the story that it's not about the lemons. It wasn't the lemons that was helping her to have joy. She told another story about being in Mexico with Living Wisdom School. The students, the high school students would go on trips for service, right, to teach service and the practice of seva. And they went to an orphanage in Mexico, and there were different projects they were doing. And one day, the group was going somewhere everyone wanted to go, but someone needed to stay back and make the lunch. And she volunteered. She said, I'll stay back and make the lunch. And she said it was a huge pot of soup, and it was a really hot day. So she was in the kitchen, meaning very unpleasant task, and she was aware of it when she said yes to it. There she is in the kitchen sweating. It was very, very hot, but she was practicing seva, serving the divine, and she said at a certain point she was stirring the soup, she was sweating, and she was very aware of the discomfort she was in the middle of in the experience, and she was filled with so much divine joy that just overcame her, just filled her completely. And she had that moment of touching karma yoga. And it's been my experience that with these practices, jnana, karma, I'll talk about bhakti in a moment here, these paths of yoga, these ways in which we practice Raja Yoga, all the tools and practices of yoga, help us, we touch it. It's not that we're perfect at it, is my point. So you can be practicing karma yoga and maybe you're feeling like that, man, I've got the wrong lemons. It's not working. I'm trying and I feel worse by the end of what I'm doing. You know, it is better to walk away. It would be better to walk away. We have to discern that for ourselves. Sometimes we take on tasks and we're not able to find the joy in it. You know, maybe we said yes to it because we felt pressure to say yes. Maybe it was an idea in our mind. Asha has talked about this. She said in the spiritual life, it's so easy to like put on spiritual practices like an outfit and feel like, oh, I have to wear this, I have to do this in order to be spiritual. It's not true. We are spiritual. We're divine. So yoga helps us shed all the falsehood, all the false identifications, certainly of not being good enough or needing to be different, in order to rest in our true knowing, our true self. So when I'm saying like putting on a garment, putting on an outfit that isn't true, when I was mentioning the colors, I don't think I finished with that. Swami said, do what feels right for you. So Tyagi vow, a vow of renunciation that couples can take, the color is white. It's also the color for Kriya Yoga. It's a spiritual color, the white. So you'll see it at Ananda for different ceremonies. People will wear white. It doesn't mean that they're Tyagi. But if you are Tyagi, then you decide for yourself, does it suit your life and suit you? And is it helpful for you to wear white all the time? What I find is that I don't wear white all the time. But I enjoy wearing white, and I do often wear it for ceremonies. Definitely, I'll wear white. Same with James. He'll wear white for ceremonies. So, okay, Bhakti Yoga. The path of divine love. And this is a path of the moving into the heart center beyond actually likes and dislikes. So bhakti, and what Yogananda said about the three paths is that we all have a natural inclination towards one or the other, and it's fine. We just naturally tend to be more one way than the other. But in Raja Yoga, we balance all three paths. So whatever my natural inclination, it's good to cultivate the others, to create within myself a sense of balance and harmony, and not to be out of balance. So bhakti, the heart devotion, it is a loving of God, and one of the natural practices for that is chanting. Swami Kriyananda, which was much more jnana, was his natural way. A master told him, when I say master, I mean Yogananda, encouraged him to chant. And he encouraged all of us to chant, because he said chanting bypasses the mind. It goes right to the heart and it opens the heart. So if someone's trying to open their heart more, live more from their heart, the more that you can chant, the easier that is to do. The other is nature. Nature is a wonderful way to help open the heart. So spending time with flowers and plants and the beauty of the natural world can help. So I think that's as far as I'm going to get today. This is one of those chapters. It's just going to, part of the practice with scripture is to take a piece, dive deeply into it, and just see what it's offering that day. We're not in a hurry. And that's what I remind myself as someone leading this. There's no rush here. So that's our focus for today, a little taste of yoga. And wishing you a beautiful week. So glad you came. Beautiful day, and Hope to see you soon. Okay, great souls.